The United States is one of the most geographically diverse countries on Earth, with everything from swamps and farmland to deserts, volcanoes, and some of the tallest mountains on the continent. That means the highest point in each state can look completely different depending on where you are. Some are so subtle you could drive right past them without even realizing you've reached the highest point in the entire state. One of the most iconic high points on this list is called Mount Sunflower, and despite the name, it hardly looks like a mountain at all. Further up the list, one summit has recorded winds of 231 miles per hour, among the most extreme ever measured anywhere on Earth. And another is part of a mountain that some people argue is actually the tallest on the planet, if you measure it from its true base far below the ocean floor. For years, reaching the highest point in every U.S. state has become a bucket list challenge for hikers, road trippers, and peak baggers, because no two state high points are even remotely the same. And by the end of this list, we won't just be talking about state high points anymore. We'll be standing on some of the most serious peaks in North America. So, what are the highest points in all 50 states, and where exactly are they? Let's go through every U.S. state high point, ranked from the lowest to the highest elevation. We start in Florida, home to the lowest state high point in the entire country. Britton Hill reaches just 345 feet, or 105 meters above sea level, which means the highest point in Florida is lower than some skyscrapers, roller coasters, and even plenty of highway overpasses. And yet, technically, this tiny rise in the Florida Panhandle beats every beach, swamp, and skyline in the state. There's even a sign and monument there, because when your highest point is this low, you kind of have to lean into the joke. Just above that is Delaware, where the highest point in the entire state is Ebright Azimuth, at just 448 feet, or 137 meters. And this one is even funnier. It's basically a small patch of land in the Wilmington suburbs, sitting just a few feet from the Pennsylvania state line. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd probably assume you were standing in somebody's yard. Then comes Louisiana, where Driskill Mountain takes the title at 535 feet, or 163 meters. Despite the name, this is not exactly what most people would picture when they hear that. It's more like a wooded hill in the north of the state, but Louisiana at least gets points for effort here, because unlike Delaware, this one actually feels like you've gone somewhere. Next is Mississippi, where Woodall Mountain rises to 807 feet, or 246 meters. And once again, it's not nearly as dramatic as the name suggests. It's tucked away in the far northeast corner of the state, and what makes it memorable is that locals fully embrace the absurdity of it. There's a marker, a picnic area, and even a mailbox where high pointers leave notes, because apparently if the summit itself isn't dramatic, the culture around it might as well be. Then we reach Rhode Island, where Jerimoth Hill comes in at 812 feet, or 247 meters, just 1 foot higher than Mississippi. For years, this one was weirdly famous because the landowner used to block access and hated visitors, which made one of the most underwhelming state high points in America oddly legendary among high pointers. Next is Illinois, where the highest point in the state is Charles Mound, at 1,235 feet, or 376 meters, and for a state as famously flat as Illinois, that honestly sounds higher than you'd expect. It sits in the far northwest corner near the Wisconsin border, surrounded by farmland, and for a long time it was only open to visitors on select weekends because it's located on private property. So even here, one of the easiest high points in America still came with a small catch. Then comes Indiana, with Hoosier Hill at 1,257 feet, or 383 meters, and somehow this one feels even more Midwestern. It's tucked into a patch of trees near the Ohio border, and despite being the highest point in the state, it looks more like the entrance to a nature trail than a major landmark. After that is Ohio, where Campbell Hill rises to 1,549 feet, or 472 meters. This one is actually inside the town of Bellefontaine, and what makes it memorable is that the summit is right next to the Ohio High Point Career Center, which might be one of the most perfectly named schools in the country. So yes, Ohio's highest point is basically next to a parking lot and a technical school. Then we get to Iowa, where Hawkeye Point reaches 1,670 feet, or 509 meters. And this is where the list starts getting a little more charming, because instead of just a marker and a shrug, Hawkeye Point has turned itself into a real little roadside attraction, with signs pointing toward the high points of all 50 states, a giant grain silo painted like an American flag, and one of the more memorable summit photo spots on the whole list. It's still in the middle of farmland, but at least Iowa understood the assignment. Next is Missouri, and finally the list starts to feel a little more mountainous. Sauk Mountain stands at 1,772 feet, or 540 meters in the St. Francois Mountains. It's still not huge, but unlike many earlier entries, this one actually feels like part of a real mountain landscape. Then comes New Jersey, where the highest point is simply called High Point, at 1,803 feet, or 550 meters, which is not exactly the most creative name on this list. But to be fair, New Jersey absolutely makes up for it. At the summit stands a 220-foot or 67-meter obelisk war memorial visible from miles away, so for the first time, a state high point really feels like a place people would go on purpose. From there, we head into Wisconsin, where Timms Hill reaches 1,951 feet, or 595 meters. It's tucked away in the forests of northern Wisconsin, and while the summit itself is modest, there's an observation tower that makes it feel more rewarding than the raw elevation suggests. Just above that is Michigan, where Mount Arvon reaches 1,979 feet, or 603 meters in the Upper Peninsula. The road in can be rough and muddy, and for years there was an actual debate with nearby Mount Curwood over which one was higher, until better surveys finally settled it. So even before the serious mountains start, Michigan already gave us a summit controversy. Next is Minnesota, where Eagle Mountain rises to 2,301 feet, or 701 meters. This is one of the first truly beautiful high points on the list. It's near the Canadian border, not far from the Boundary Waters, and unlike the earlier roadside markers, reaching it means a real hike through forest, rock, and lakes country. Then we get to Connecticut, which has one of the stranger high points in the country. The highest point in the state is on the slope of Mount Frissell at 2,379 feet, or 725 meters. But the actual summit of Mount Frissell is in Massachusetts, which means Connecticut's high point technically isn't even a summit at all. It's just the highest spot where the state line crosses the mountain. After that comes Alabama, where Cheaha Mountain reaches 2,413 feet, or 735 meters. And this is one of the first high points that feels more impressive than the number suggests. It rises prominently above the surrounding terrain, and the stone overlooks built by the Civilian Conservation Corps make it feel much more dramatic than many higher points we've already seen. Then we get to Arkansas, where Mount Magazine stands at 2,753 feet, or 839 meters. It's the highest point in the state, but it's also a broad plateau-like summit area rather than one sharp peak. With cliffs, trails, and even hang gliding conditions nearby, this is another one that feels like a real destination, not just a box to check. Next is Pennsylvania, where the highest point is Mount Davis, at 3,213 feet, or 979 meters. For a state so tied to the Appalachians, that number can feel a little lower than expected. The summit itself is mostly wooded, but there's an observation tower nearby, which becomes a recurring theme on this list. Sometimes the tower matters more than the actual summit. Then comes Maryland, where Hoy Crest reaches 3,360 feet, or 1,024 meters, on Backbone Mountain along the West Virginia border. It's one of those high points that feels quietly overlooked, but the Appalachian setting is genuinely nice, and the name honestly sounds more dramatic than most places at this elevation. After that is Massachusetts, where Mount Greylock rises to 3,491 feet, or 1,064 meters. And this is where the list starts getting noticeably more impressive again. Mount Greylock is one of the most iconic peaks in all of New England. There's a road to the summit, a stone war memorial tower on top, and on a clear day, the views can stretch across 5 states. It even has one of the only true taiga-like forests in the state near its upper slopes, which makes it feel a little more northern and wild than most people probably expect from Massachusetts. Then we jump west to North Dakota, where the highest point is White Butte, at 3,506 feet, or 1,069 meters. Set out in the Badlands near the South Dakota line, it's on private land, but access is usually allowed if visitors follow the rules. This is one of those places where the scenery matters more than the summit itself, because the surrounding emptiness makes it feel far bigger than the number suggests. Next is South Carolina, where Sassafras Mountain reaches 3,560 feet, or 1,085 meters. And this one has a fun quirk. The mountain sits on the border with North Carolina, but the actual high point marker for South Carolina is on the South Carolina side, while the easiest way to drive there is often from North Carolina first. Then comes Kansas, home to one of the funniest entries on the entire list. Mount Sunflower stands at 4,039 feet, or 1,231 meters, and despite the name, it barely looks like a mountain at all. There's no summit cone, no ridgeline, no obvious peak. It's basically the highest point along the slow upward tilt of the Great Plains near the Colorado border, and somehow, that makes it one of the most iconic state high points in America. After that is Kentucky, where Black Mountain rises to 4,145 feet, or 1,263 meters near the Virginia line. This one feels much more legit. It's part of the old coal country of the Central Appalachians, and for years access was tied up with private land and mining roads, which gave it a reputation for being more complicated than the elevation suggests. From there we move into Vermont, where Mount Mansfield reaches 4,395 feet, or 1,340 meters. Its ridgeline is famous for resembling a human profile, with sections nicknamed the forehead, nose, lips, and chin, and it also holds some of the last true alpine tundra in Vermont. By this point, we are clearly not talking about roadside curiosities anymore. Next is Georgia, where Brasstown Bald rises to 4,784 feet, or 1,458 meters. This one is a classic. It's easy to visit, and on a clear day, the observation deck offers huge views across the southern Appalachians. There's even a shuttle for visitors who don't want to hike the final stretch, which might make it one of the most accessible major state high points in the east. Then comes West Virginia, where Spruce Knob reaches 4,863 feet, or 1,482 meters. And this one feels exactly like what people imagine when they think of West Virginia: remote, forested, windswept, and high above endless ridges. The red spruce around the summit gives it a colder, almost northern feel. After that is Oklahoma, and the contrast here is great. The highest point in the state is Black Mesa, at 4,973 feet, or 1,516 meters, all the way out in the far western panhandle. If your mental image of Oklahoma is mostly flat plains, this place completely breaks that expectation. It looks and feels much more like the edge of the American Southwest. Then we head north to Maine, where Mount Katahdin rises to 5,269 feet, or 1,606 meters. This is one of the most iconic mountains in the eastern United States because it's not just the highest point in Maine, it's also the northern end of the Appalachian Trail. For hikers who have spent months walking north from Georgia, Katahdin isn't just a summit, it's the finish line. Next is New York, where Mount Marcy reaches 5,344 feet, or 1,629 meters in the Adirondacks. This is the highest point in New York, and it feels much more rugged than people outside the region might expect. The Adirondacks are older than the Rockies, but still rising geologically, which is a wild detail on its own, and Marcy sits right in the middle of that rough, glaciated landscape. Then comes Nebraska, where the highest point is Panorama Point, at 5,424 feet, or 1,653 meters. Like Kansas, it doesn't really feel like a summit in the traditional sense. It's more of a subtle rise near the Wyoming and Colorado borders, and if you stood there without the marker, you might not realize you were on the highest ground in the state. But Nebraska at least gets a great name out of it. Then we reach Virginia, where Mount Rogers stands at 5,729 feet, or 1,746 meters. The funny part is that the actual summit is completely wooded, so there's no huge payoff at the top. Instead, what makes Mount Rogers famous is the surrounding high country, especially the open grassy balds nearby, where wild ponies roam the ridgelines. So Virginia's highest point may not have the best summit view, but it might have one of the best summit areas. From there we get to New Hampshire, home to one of the most famous state high points in the country. Mount Washington rises to 6,288 feet, or 1,917 meters, and for its elevation, it might be the most notorious weather mountain on this entire list. This is where a wind speed of 231 miles per hour, or 372 kilometers per hour, was once recorded, one of the most extreme non-tornado, non-hurricane wind measurements ever observed on Earth. That alone has turned Mount Washington into a legend. Next is Tennessee, where the highest point is Clingman's Dome at 6,643 feet, or 2,025 meters. It sits right on the border with North Carolina in the Great Smoky Mountains, and if you have seen that massive concrete observation tower spiraling above the trees, that's this place. It's one of the most visited high points in America, partly because it's so accessible, and partly because the Smokies are already one of the most popular mountain landscapes in the country. Then comes North Carolina, where Mount Mitchell rises to 6,684 feet, or 2,037 meters. And this is a real milestone in the video, because Mount Mitchell is not just the highest point in North Carolina, it's the highest point east of the Mississippi River. That alone gives it a special place on this list. After that, we head west again to South Dakota, where Black Elk Peak stands at 7,244 feet, or 2,208 meters, in the Black Hills. The Black Hills rise dramatically out of the surrounding plains, so even though this is far from the tallest mountain we'll see, it has a real presence. It's also one of the most culturally meaningful peaks on the list, named after Black Elk, the Oglala Lakota holy man. Then comes Texas, where Guadalupe Peak rises to 8,751 feet, or 2,667 meters. And this one feels exactly like what a Texas high point should be. Big, isolated, dry, dramatic, and visible from miles away. It sits in far west Texas near the New Mexico border, and unlike the flatter states earlier on, this one actually looks like a proper summit. Next is Oregon, where the highest point is Mount Hood, at 11,249 feet, or 3,429 meters. And now, the list makes a serious jump. Mount Hood isn't just Oregon's highest point, it's one of the most recognizable mountains in America. It's a fully glaciated stratovolcano that still counts as potentially active, which means Oregon's highest point isn't just scenic. It's a real volcano with real hazards. Then comes Arizona, where Humphreys Peak rises to 12,633 feet, or 3,851 meters. This one sits just north of Flagstaff in the San Francisco Peaks, and it's one of the most surprising mountains on the entire list, because when most people picture Arizona, they think of desert, canyons, and saguaro cactus, not a 12,000-foot alpine summit. Humphreys Peak completely breaks that expectation, and on a clear day, the view from the top stretches across an enormous chunk of northern Arizona, including all the way toward the Grand Canyon region. After that is Idaho, where Bora Peak reaches 12,668 feet, or 3,861 meters. And this is where things start getting a lot more serious for actual climbers. Bora is one of the first high points where the route itself has a real reputation, especially because of a narrow exposed section known as Chicken Out Ridge, which is a name that tells you exactly what you need to know. Next is Montana, where Granite Peak rises to 12,807 feet, or 3,904 meters. And this is where the challenge jumps again. Granite Peak is widely considered one of the hardest state high points in the lower 48. Depending on conditions, it can involve exposure, route finding, snow, and enough commitment that many climbers treat it like a real mountaineering objective, not just another state high point. Then comes Nevada, where Boundary Peak stands at 13,147 feet, or 4,007 meters. And this one has a funny technical twist. Boundary Peak is officially Nevada's highest point, but it's actually just a sub-peak of Montgomery Peak, a slightly taller mountain just across the line in California. So Nevada technically wins by state line, not by mountain dominance. After that is New Mexico, where Wheeler Peak rises to 13,167 feet, or 4,013 meters. This one sits near Taos, and it's one of the most beautiful alpine high points in the Southwest. The route is usually much more approachable than something like Granite Peak, but the setting is incredible. Lakes, high forests, broad tundra, and a summit that feels far more Rocky Mountain than desert Southwest. Then comes Utah, where Kings Peak reaches 13,534 feet, or 4,125 meters, in the Uinta Mountains. And this one is a classic high pointer favorite. The hike is long, the terrain is remote, and unlike many western ranges in the US, the Uintas run east to west, which is a weird and very noticeable geographic quirk. By the time you reach Kings Peak, you're deep in one of the most underrated alpine regions in the country, and it's the kind of summit that feels earned. Then we leave the lower 48 for the first time and head to Hawaii, where Mauna Kea rises to 13,803 feet, or 4,207 meters above sea level. And this is one of the most fascinating high points on the entire list, because while that elevation already makes it one of the tallest state high points in America, Mauna Kea is famous for another reason entirely. If you measure it from its true base on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, it rises by over 33,000 feet, or more than 10,000 meters, which means, by that measurement, it's actually taller than Everest. That's why some people argue it's the tallest mountain on Earth. Then comes Wyoming, where Gannett Peak stands at 13,810 feet, or 4,209 meters. And this is where state high pointing starts getting genuinely intimidating. Gannett is the highest point in Wyoming, but unlike some other western peaks, the hardest part isn't just the summit, it's getting there. The mountain sits deep in the Wind River Range, and reaching it usually means a long remote approach, glacier travel, and a serious commitment. Next is Washington, where Mount Rainier rises to 14,411 feet, or 4,392 meters. And now, we're into truly elite mountains. Rainier is not just Washington's highest point, it's one of the most imposing and dangerous volcanoes in North America. It's heavily glaciated, massively prominent, and so dominant over the surrounding landscape that it almost looks unreal when the weather is clear. So yes, Washington's highest point is a stunning icon, but it's also a mountain with crevasses, avalanches, volcanic hazards, and enough objective danger that nobody serious would ever treat it casually. After that is Colorado, where Mount Elbert stands at 14,440 feet, or 4,401 meters. And while Mount Elbert doesn't have the same dramatic shape as Rainier, it has a different kind of status. It's the highest point in Colorado, and more importantly, it's the highest peak in the entire Rocky Mountains. That alone makes it a huge landmark in American geography. And compared to several of the brutal mountains around it, Mount Elbert is relatively straightforward by standard hiking routes, which is exactly why it's become such a popular goal. Then comes California, where Mount Whitney rises to 14,505 feet, or 4,421 meters. This is the highest point in the lower 48 states, and it has one of the wildest geographic contrasts anywhere in America. Because from Whitney's summit, you're right beside the Owens Valley, and just to the east is Death Valley, the lowest point in North America. And then finally, there's Alaska. The highest point in Alaska and the highest point in the entire United States is Denali, at 20,310 feet, or 6,190 meters. And compared to everything else on this list, Denali is in a completely different league. It's not just the tallest peak in North America, it's also one of the most physically imposing mountains on Earth, because from base to summit, Denali rises far more dramatically than Everest does above its surrounding terrain. This is not a high point you casually check off. This is a full-scale expedition mountain, and an appropriate final entry for a list that started on a tiny hill in Florida and ended on one of the most serious peaks on the planet. So, after seeing what this list actually includes, do you think you could finish the challenge? Let me know in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. For more interesting content, check out my other stuff. Thanks for watching.